Hi, folks. Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today. Tacitus today at your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio, radio, no pictures. Listen to this in your car as you're driving along live stream. In this essay, I'd like to refer to some texts of eyewitness accounts of the French Revolution and when the terror began in earnest and street mobs. Well, they didn't have machetes; they were using sabers, the swords of the day. Were running around hacking people to death in the most unpleasant manner, and no one could have seen this coming, or certainly not the extent of it. There was a concurrent sort of breakdown of law and order. The authorities were quite accepting of the street murdering, the rando murdering of people and hacking them to death in the street, and the violence and the bloodlust of the mob was something that I don't think anyone could have foreseen. In June 1792, it appeared that everything was going to settle down. The king had been given the royalty had been given a place in the constitution. The king really had sort of, not only a job for life, but slightly more powers than an American president had. The right of veto, things like that. So it seemed like it was all going to settle down. And then suddenly in August 1792, it all boiled over. Now, the bloodlust and anger of the mob is something that once it gets out of control, it seems to be very hard to put back in the box. There were similarly those of the revolutionary government that rather liked the idea of mobs running around hacking people to death in the most obscene manner, by the way. And so there's very little attempt to stop it, if any at all. You could have individual officers of the guard might act to protect certain people, but and on certain circumstances, but even they were at risk. Someone could accuse them of being counter-revolutionary. They too would be taken out in the street and hacked to death. So over a period of a few days, depending on whose numbers you look at, between 1,200, it's just in Paris, by the way, between 1,200 and 1,500 people were hacked to death, some tortured and killed slowly and so on, and their eyewitness accounts of this. Just to sort of give you a wider backdrop, Paris was the centre of French culture and France was the centre of European culture. If you spoke French and aped and affected French manners, ate French cuisine, used French fragrances, French clothing and that sort of thing, then you were considered to be cultured and sophisticated. So Paris was the epicenter of European sophistication in manners, in behavior, in courteous behavior, in the way you dressed, the way you looked, the way you spoke, and so on. This was the epicenter. It wasn't London at the time. London maybe later would become that, but not at the time. So France was at the French royal court, and the behaviors, and this goes back to even before Louis XIV, the Sun King, the French manners and behaviours, again, etiquette and social etiquette was considered to be the apex of how one should behave and what one should aspire to. And everyone in England, the upper classes in England, it was mandatory that you spoke French. That would indicate your sophistication. Now, that would change later over time, but at the time, that was it. So we're talking about the city that in European circles, at least, and wider European circles at that, this was the epicenter of cultural sophistication. And it was suddenly to just degrade into, again, armed mobs running around hacking people to death. So now, just as a sort of a wider consideration here, as the West imports more and more people from places like Somalia and Ethiopia and so on, where armed machete mobs are very much how things are. You might see a small footnote really in the international media. Might look through and say, well, 50 people were hacked to death in Somalia by armed mobs and so on. We don't really think about it. It's in the third world. It's far, far away. We shrug our shoulders and go, well, that's how things are in places like that. I was looking, you regularly see in, say, places like Bangladesh or Pakistan that somebody is accused of having blasphemed in some way. Well, nobody knows how. What did they say? Well, hey, who cares? And suddenly a mob forms, and this person, whether they did or didn't blaspheme or whatever, there's no court process or legal process. A mob descends upon them and hacks them to death in the middle of the street. Now, in all cases, the authorities seem to be unable to stop this or prevent it. One suspects they somehow look upon it as, well, as long as the mob's creating trouble there and hacking those few people to death, we won't have to worry about them causing problems elsewhere. So there seems to be a tacit acceptance amongst the governing class that this rando arbitrary hacking to death of people in the street is somehow an acceptable practice, or not one that you would want to stop. Now, the rub is that in the West, Western governments, under the control of the globalists, are importing more and more people into the West who come from machete hacking societies, where machete hacking is like, that's how things are around here. Nobody nobody believes they're going to be arrested and put in prison for it. It's just how things are, and that's it. And more of these people are making up, if you look at the total intake of people all across the West, and you look at the proportion of people coming from machete hacking societies, then they're making up a larger and larger proportion of the people coming in, to the point where entire suburbs are being taken up by these sort of people. Now, it's no surprise that in places where Somalians are, for example, I'm not singling them out per se, Somalians are in the majority in the area, then the crime levels reflect that, I believe, in my opinion. So let's have a look at this. Now, remember, we're talking at the most sophisticated city, or supposedly, in Europe. I'm going to read these eyewitness accounts of what's going on. These are people in the Tuileries, the royal palace. So they were shown no mercy. The mob poured into the palace, cutting down everyone they found: door ushers, pages, cooks, servants, teachers. They threw the bodies out of the windows and they impaled heads on pikes. They scattered body parts over the floors. Those who tried to escape were struck down as they ran across the gardens, or were hacked down under the trees and besides the fountains. They stabbed them as they were falling to their feet with pikes. Young children were seen playing with human heads. One of the murderers commented, "The heavens have been good to me. I killed 3 counter-revolutionaries," as supposedly is, "with my own hands." Here's another eyewitness account. This is in the royal palace, "I ran from room to room, and finding the apartments of the royal palace and the staircases already strewn with dead bodies and body parts, because they'd been hacked to pieces, I resolved to jump out of one of the windows onto the terraces. I reached one of the gates of the palace gardens, and the mob was there butchering several people and then stripping them. One of them came up to me with a sword in his hand, saying, 'Hello, citizen, help us continue the killing.' Luckily, another member of the mob seized a sword, and as I was dressed in a plain coat, I was able to make my escape. I came across another body of armed men, and their hands were red with blood, and they calmly related to each other the accounts of the many murders they had committed that day. The men were still, in the evening as night was falling, the mob were continuing the slaughtering. Others were cutting off the heads of those who were already dead, while women, as part of the mob, had lost all sense of shame, were cutting off the scrotum and penis of the dead bodies, and they tore these pieces of flesh with them in triumph, pinning them to their clothing. I went on to cross a bridge in Paris, and it was covered with the naked carcasses of men already in a state of putrefaction from the hot weather that summer. This is in August. Many of the palace guards had been slaughtered in the palace grounds. Others were arrested and taken to a place where they were told they would get a fair trial. When they arrived there, and the mob then descended and slaughtered them also. So I think you get the idea. I'm going to look at a couple of others here that the Revolutionary Committee declared that the revolution should be treated like a battle in which the victor shared the loot and all the splendid houses, the fine food, the handsome clothes, and the women of their dreams. They considered the pleasures of life that were so now going to be available to them, given they were killing off the aristocrats. The enemies of the revolution had to be identified and punished, and to do this, vigilance committees were established. And more violent measures became necessary to quell the counter-revolutionaries. They must throw themselves on their enemies, the revolutionary committees decided. A bit more talking about how they seized the homes of the wealthy. There was a group of priests who were being escorted, military escort, and priests were very much the target of the mob. So the leader of the mob, waving a sword, rushed up to one of the carriages carrying the priests and plunged his sabre in through the open window. Passers-by gasped in horror as he waved the reddened blade at them and shouted, "So this frightened you, does it, you cowards? You must get used to the sight of death and blood." He then continued slashing at the prisoners, as the priests, cutting open the face of one, the shoulder of another, slicing off the hands of a fourth who tried to protect his head. In the bloodlust, the rest of the mob joined in the attack, and soon blood was dripping from all the carriages as the horses dragged them along their way to the doors of the prison, dead bodies dropping out and the like. When they arrived at the prison or the detention centre where the priests were going to be given some sort of a trial, there's another mob waiting, and then cut the rest to pieces and killed them all. In another instance, a small gang of armed men burst into a church, and the men advanced on them, the mob advanced on them, and then pulled out swords and cut them down and striking them across the face and the head and putting a pike through their chest. In another church, while the priests were saying prayers for the dying and the injured, an armed gang broke through the door and dragged the priests and the other parishioners out to slaughter them in the garden of the church. Several had been killed when the man of air of authority arrived at church, calling out, "Don't kill them so quickly. We have to torture them and kill them slowly." Some bodies were taken away in carts to be burned. Others were thrown down a well. And their bodies and the skeletons were discovered 70 years later. In another situation here, the mob broke into a prison, but they didn't know who were the inmates who were there for actual crimes, who were there for political crimes, and so they didn't bother to be discerning. They broke in with armed swords, pikes, hatchets, and iron bars, set about their work, resting from time to time to drink wine or eat meals, which women brought them to sustain them, so they said, in their hard labours. One of the eyewitnesses recorded the event and heard with horror the screams and victims that were being killed in the gardens. The most important matter, this is an eyewitness account, that employed our thoughts was to consider what posture we should put ourselves into when dragged to the place of slaughter in order to suffer death with the least pain. Occasionally, we asked some of our companions to go to the turret window to watch the attitude of the victims. They came back to say that those who tried to protect themselves with their hands suffered the longest, as the blows and the blades cut off their hands and arms before their bodies fell. Those who put their hands behind their backs and bowed their heads suffered the least. We therefore recognised the advantages of this posture and advised each other to adopt it when it came to our turn to be butchered. The mob, here's another one here, where the mob battered down the doors where the prisoners had tried to barricade themselves and hacked to pieces until the mangled remains of 378 corpses were piled up in heaps. Having killed numerous people in their rooms, a party of assassins mounted the stairs looking for other victims, which they similarly hacked to pieces. There was a young woman in the courtyard, and they didn't know who she was, so the armed mob assumes that she was an enemy of the revolution. So they killed her slowly here, hacked off her breasts, then hacked off her feet, and nailed her hands to the floor. And then, while she was still alive, set a fire underneath her. As corpses were loaded on carts, women from the mob came along, often slipping on the blood that was on the ground and cutting off the ears of the dead, which they then pinned to their dresses. Here's another eyewitness account. The carts were full of men and women who'd just been slaughtered and whose limbs were still flexible because they had they'd been killed only moments ago, so rigor mortis hadn't set in. So as the cart moved along, their arms and legs and heads nodded and dangled to either side of the carts. I can still remember those drunken men. And I remember a particular very skinny one with a pale, sharp, pointed nose. The monster went to speak to another man and said, "Do you see that rotten old priest in the pile over there?" He went and hauled the priest to his feet. This is the dead body, by the way. But the body was still warm. The drunken man held it up, hitting it across the face and shouting, "I had enough trouble killing this old brute." It continues. As we walked past the mob that had just finished their killing, one called out, "Do you want to see the heart of an aristocrat?" And tearing open the corpse with his sword, ripped out the heart, squeezing the blood into a cup and drinking part of it and offering the rest to those who would drink with him. A young woman who was there with her father was told if she drank the blood of an aristocrat, they would spare her father. People were gathering around the murdering and sitting around watching these murders in comfort, cheering and clapping as it went on. Another witness saw a group of butchers tired out and no longer able to lift their arms, the exhaustion over all the murdering. And they were drinking brandy with some gunpowder mixed in to aggravate their fury. And they were sitting around a circle of corpses and they took their bread and soaked it in the blood of their still quivering victims. I mean, it goes on here. I don't know whether it's worth adding to this, but I think you get the picture. This is not a pleasant situation, far from it. Now, my concern, and I'm sure the concern of others, is this turn of events, this level of madness and butchery was unexpected in Paris in the day, and the pent-up fury of the people that are doing this is also something worth considering. How did they become that furious when it looked in June 1792? It seemed everything had calmed down, but that clearly wasn't the case. So how far away, and given the hatred that is being poured on white people are guilty of all the sins of the universe, white supremacy, white people should be guilty. We should make sure white people don't get jobs, don't get places in university. These are the things that your straight white male dominated government is doing. Globalist controlled, of course. So clearly the globalists have slated white people, particularly the classic sort of working and middle class people, for destruction and eradication. So how close are we to getting to this? Already in many Western places, they're talking about replacing the white police force with people from the likes of the Somalias and the Pakistans and the Bangladeshis and Nigerias, where street hatchet mobs and machete mobs are the go. So I'm sort of thinking here in wider terms, just how close are we to such a possibility? Again, Paris, the most sophisticated city in Europe, where it's unthinkable that something like this could or might or would occur. But it did, and it occurred in the most brutal and horrific manner. How close, how possible is it that we could see something like this in the West today, given the vehement and intense hatred of white people? You've been with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.